For Yang.
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds! Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds! So nerds!
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds!
Hello, fellow nerds.
Oh my goodness!
I admit, I'm a nerd.
We have another verified nerd on the Nerds for Yang channel. Robin Hanson from GMU, George Mason University. Thank you so much for coming on to the live stream. How you doing?
It's great to be here. I'm
Well,
excited to figure out what we're going to talk about.
yeah. Well, you were highly recommended by one of our viewers. I think it was Andrew. No pressure. One of our viewers, Andrew Smith, who I think recommends a lot of people to my channel, and I always take his recommendations into account. And maybe for those of us in the Nerds for Yang Nation who are not familiar with who Robin Hanson is, maybe you could just start with a quick intro.
I'm a professor of economics at George Mason University. I have an affiliation with the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford. I spent 9 years as a computer researcher at Lockheed and NASA years ago. I had a physics undergraduate and master's degree long ago. And I have these two books, one behind me, you see, The Age of M, Work, Love, and Life When Robots Rule the Earth, and more recently, The Elephant in the Brain, Hidden Motives in Everyday Life. And I'm working now on what my next book will be.
Oh my goodness. So you seem like a perfect guest for a channel that has to do with Andrew Yang, partly because, you know, a big theme of his is humanity first, and he talks a lot about artificial intelligence and automation. Could you tell us a little bit more about this Humanity Institute, the Oxford thing? I hadn't heard of that.
So it's called the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford. Mm-hmm. Its leading scholar is Nick Bostrom, who had the book Superintelligence, which you may have heard of, about what happens if there are really, really smart computers in the future. And they just study a lot of different topics related to the future and policy related to the future. And,
so lucky to
be associated with it.
Yeah. Well, let's get right into that one. Like, what is your take? I know for the Yang 2020 campaign, we often talk about the disruption to man's, need for labor and people with lower skills or less rare skills, let's say. But I often wonder and hope, I guess maybe the optimist in me, that there could be a brighter future for all of us, that we have more leisure time. We don't have to do as much menial work, and we live longer. What's your take?
All right. So I've always been really interested in the future. I think in the long run, enormous changes will happen, just like enormous changes have happened in the past. So it's really hard not to believe that over, substantial centuries, et cetera, huge changes will happen, overwhelming changes. And that's fascinating, and I really want to understand them. There's a temptation among futurists who think about the long run to also claim that big things are happening soon. Mm-hmm. And I'm not one of those people. So I actually have a recent analysis we posted about how automation over the last 20 years, basically very little has changed right up to this last year, 2019. So I don't actually think much is changing right now or about to change in the next 10 or 20 years. But in the longer run, definitely enormous things will happen. And I even think it's okay or reasonable to think about it ahead of time in order to prepare what you would think of as insurance. So at some point, basically, robots will basically take all the jobs and humans won't have any. And at that moment, if you don't have some other source of income, you could be in serious trouble. So it's well worth preparing for that day. But I think the right way to do that is insurance. That is, in any 1 year, the odds are low. Mm-hmm. And so you can pay a premium that isn't that expensive to cover the risk when it does happen. That would be my favorite policy to deal with. So, but eventually robots will take all the jobs, but then humans will own pretty much everything at that point. And so the economy will start growing faster. It might double every month. And that means your wealth and investments double every month. So even a modest nest egg can very quickly become enormous. So humans can do very well as comfortable, retired, rich capitalists the overlords of the robot world. You know, at least for a while.
Is that an argument that we should all buy real estate? Will that be the only asset worth
No,
owning?
Stocks, patents, all sorts of things valuable in the economy will be valuable then. But it's an argument that you should not be too sure you know what's going to be valuable. So most likely most of the robot economy will concentrate it into a small number of very dense, very active cities. You don't know where those cities will be. Lots of other land could be pretty worthless.
Yeah.
But if you happen to get the land under one of those cities and own that, you're golden. But
yeah,
don't assume too much you know where that'll be. So just buy lots of land and or lots of stock, lots of assets, and then that will help cover you. So one way, of course, to insure yourself against this eventual risk is to just own stuff that will be valuable then. But you can also more directly buy insurance. And again, that's my recommendation.
And what have you done, Robin? Are you doing anything, or your family doing anything to kind of prepare for this?
Like I say, well, I'm 60 years old. So in the next 20 years, not much is going to happen, but then by that point, I'll be 80. So I'm already going to be retired. So I will already be prepared for the need to retire. So I don't need any extra preparation for the possibility of retiring because robots.
What about
children and other
your younger friends and children? Yeah.
So for them, I want to warn them about upcoming potential changes and to help them prepare. So for policy-wise, say someone like Yang, we can think about what should the nation do, or states or cities do, to prepare for their people, to protect their people against this sort of risk. But you individually maybe shouldn't trust them to do something. You should do something yourself as well. In which case, the simplest thing would be just to own assets that are generally valuable. But then we could also try to work to create actual insurance products that would pay into the situation. And that would be a good thing to work as groups together to maybe get these insurance going. My book about the Age of M is actually about a scenario where the kind of robots that appear that displace the jobs are very human-like robots. They are brain emulations. That is, you take individual human brains and you scan them and find spatial and chemical detail, and then you make computer simulations of those particular brains. And if you can make those cheap, then you can make lots of copies, you can make them fast. And those kind of emulations are very human-like, and they each descend from a human. That is, each brain emulation is the copy of a particular human brain. So in that scenario, you or your children or your grandchildren might hope to be the human who is the originator of that kind of robot. In which case, you might hope to your descendants, in that sense, to prosper in this world of robots. That is, in this scenario, it's not that you and the things you value disappear or sidelined if you're willing to see the robot copy of you as you and your descendant. In which case, I can recommend to my children and grandchildren, try to become the sort of people who will be well suited to making this transition.
To being cloned, or
to becoming, yes, brain emulations of themselves. So, I mean, it's a head scratcher in the sense that, I mean, as you said, what's my attitude of the future? It's a very different, weird world. So the most basic trends in history that we should understand, one is really big changes happen over long time scales. So you should never be that comfortable with the future in the sense that it's going to be weird. It's going to be really different. And you'll have to get used to some pretty big changes in that world, unless you can somehow take over and make it not happen. And the other main thing we know about history is that it's been accelerating. It hasn't been accelerating steadily. It mostly grows at steady rates, and then there are sudden transitions. But there are these three great eras in our history. Today, we're in the industrial era, where the economy doubles roughly every 15 years. But about 200 years ago, there was a transition from a previous farming era that doubled only every 1,000 years. And that had gone on for 10,000 years. And before that, there was a forager era that had doubled perhaps every 250,000 years. And even before humans, 1 million years ago, there was an era of animal brains doubling maybe every 30 million years. And so the long-term sweep of history so far is growth modes that have sudden transitions to much faster growth modes. And that's therefore the most likely prediction for our near future, is that at some point in the next century or two, we will hit another transition, at which point the economy will stop doubling every 15 years like it is now and double perhaps every month.
And so you think that's most likely going to happen in the next century or two. So
Exactly.
probably for people that are able to watch this live,
Yes.
life may not change that much. You think in the next 10, 20 years, you think it'll
Right.
be
So it's pretty
more like
unlikely in
today?
the next 20 years. So
Mhm.
I think we'll get clues ahead of time for any sort of AI transition. I don't think it'll be something that just pops up in the news on a Monday morning that you had no warning of. So just like people today are warning of a upcoming automation transition or problem,
Mhm.
they think they are doing that on the basis of clues they see. When I look at the details, I think, no, you're not really seeing anything different now than we've seen for the last 50 years. But eventually there will be something big. And then before that, you will see substantial clues of that. And that would be the point time at which you should really focus and worry. But not right now. So that's I'm paradoxically in this mix of really saying there's really going to be huge changes eventually,
Right.
and that it's worth preparing for them now, but not really backing the everything is about to change right now story. So
Now, Robin, how do you differentiate literally robots like, these versions of human brains and things from just straight up software automation and kind of
exactly.
efficiency?
So
How do
I'd
you
say
think
those
about
are, in a sense, two basic paths to producing smart machines. There are even other paths, but those are, in a sense, the leading contenders. Obviously, for the last 70 years, we have been slowly improving computer hardware and software,
that?
and we see a relatively steady trend of that. And if you look at that trend, nothing's happening soon, and that trend looks like it'll take many centuries. So, but that is a steady thing that's been happening. There's this other approach of brain emulation, which we haven't done any of it yet in the sense, but it requires three technologies to be good enough, and all those three technologies are improving in the background. They're not improving for the purpose of brain emulation, but they are improving. That's computers in general, especially cheap, fast parallel computers, and brain scans, i.e. taking human brains and scanning them for all their fine spatial and chemical detail, and then brain cell models, how to model a particular brain cell as something that takes signals in, sends signals out, and changes its state. So those three technologies are improving steadily, and they may well need to improve for another century or two, but eventually they will reach the stage where they are capable of doing a full brain emulation. And my guess is that will happen before the sort of other software that we're familiar with actually is able to reach human level abilities across the board.
So let me give you an example, like a very low level, low tech example of something that I noticed just yesterday. So I took my kids to watch Star Wars because we are a nerd family.
Of course.
And I was complaining because I wasn't able to purchase the tickets on my phone in advance because there was some error and I had to go to the actual theater to buy tickets. So I went to the theater and there was this long line. We were very frustrated because we had to wait in line and we're getting closer and closer to showtime and I was worried about seats. Then as we got through, we noticed a whole bank of self kind of checkout where you could buy the tickets. And I was like, well, what the heck? Like, why did we wait in line with these three tellers when I could have just walked through the glass doors and bought it in 10 seconds?
Right.
And I think a lot of people notice this sort of automated retail clerk experience in more and more places. Is your view that, well, those clerks will find, the economy will find other things for them to do? This is not different than any other kind of introduction of new technology, like the buggy whip, the buggy drivers, they got other jobs, everything will be fine. Is that your take as well?
So first I'd say during the last 2 centuries, during the industrial era, the economy has been doubling roughly every 15 years. Pause and think about what that means. That means every 15 years, we are able to do twice as much of just about everything. Overall, in all the different things we do twice as much every 15 years. Now, if you've lived more than 15 years, if you've lived, say, 30 years or even 60, you look back 15 years and it doesn't feel that different. You think, well, that's pretty much the same world. It's a few things have changed, but you're missing the fact that a lot of stuff has changed. So when I say that today isn't that different, we're continuing the patterns that we have over the last century. That's not to say a lot doesn't change in 15 years. a lot has to change in 15 years in order for the economy to be able to make twice as much of everything. And so I'd say, yes, today retail becoming automated is part of the long-term trend. It's a welcome part of the trend. And it's the sort of thing you expect on sort of most major categories every 15 years, a lot of change, a lot of improvement. But it's not out of the trend. We've been continuing this way for a long time. And especially importantly, in the last 10 years, we don't see much different than in the last 20. But we've seen a pretty steady trend. So actually, I have this data analysis looking at all the US jobs in the last 20 years. And for each one, we have data on how automated it was in different years. And we have 250 other pieces of data about these jobs. And so we can ask what features of jobs most predict which jobs get or how automated. And we can ask, have those features changed over 20 years? And the basic,
what does it tell you?
So the basic, the strongest predictor is when the job you're doing has to keep up with some piece of equipment. Pace determined by speed of equipment. You're doing a thing, there's a machine near you that's doing a thing. In order for you to do your job well, you need to keep up with that machine. That's the thing that most predicts whether a job is automated. And of course it makes sense. If you have a thing you're coordinating that the machine can do, that's probably something you try to have a machine to do the thing you're doing. Yes. You're using similar inputs, you're similar environment, etc. So that's the strongest predictor. The second strongest predictor, I think, is that the environment is controlled, or basically that you're not wearing some special equipment in a harsh environment. If you're wearing some special, outfit and goggles, etc., that's a kind of a harsh environment. It'll be hard to put a machine in there to automate because they're kind of finicky. And that's the second strongest predictor of automating a job. Now, these predictors, I got 25 of them. And they can explain over half the variance in which jobs are how automated. And they haven't changed in 20 years. That's the key message. None of these predictors have changed in 20 years. That is, they all have exactly the same relative weight. The thing that predicts whether a job is being automated now is exactly the same they predicted it 20 years ago. So deep learning, whatever new technology have shown up, they haven't really made a dent in the data set of which jobs are more or less automated.
Do you see the pace of automation steady or going up?
Yes, the pace is steady. That's the point. This pace is steady. The types of things automated seem to be steady. So no substantial change. You've heard a lot of things in the news about people very worried about big changes. But again, look, when it's not raining, it's a good time to think about flood insurance. Right. When it's pouring, maybe not such a good time actually to buy flood insurance. The insurance companies are going to be a little skittish that something they don't. So this is a good time now, well ahead of the robots taking the jobs, to think about how we want to prepare for it.
And Robin, when you use the term insurance, is that a metaphor, or are you literally talking about a financial instrument that you purchase?
Well, I'm an economist, a professor of economics, and we do both. That is, we think of a lot of things as metaphorically like insurance. So, for example, people call many kinds of government benefits social insurance, unemployment insurance, Social Security, Medicare. We call those social insurance in the sense that, well, we've set up this program that takes care of you when various bad things go wrong. It's not set up officially as an insurance program in the sense that you don't pay premiums and the premiums aren't related to your risk, et cetera, but it's still insurance in the sense of covering the risk. So what I'm recommending using the word insurance is to be ambiguous there. I'm saying, do it one way or the other. Either pay a premium, get a contract and get your insurance, or set up some government program that covers the risks instead. Either one will address the problem.
And does the market offer in case your job gets automated insurance?
No, it doesn't. So that would be the thing, is to start showing them there's a demand for it, asking them to offer it to you. And maybe if there's regulatory obstacles in the way, trying to get rid of those, try to set it up so that we can buy this insurance, or even your company can buy it for you, or your city or your state.
That would be so interesting. One of the factors that you talked about in terms of predicting if your job would be likely to be automated was the extent to which you have to keep up with another machine or with a machine. And that it's also, I guess the second factor is if it's in a controlled kind of stable physical environment.
Right.
That kind of sounds like a lot of factories though, isn't it?
Of course.
Yeah. And so, like, what's your
yes, of
take?
course, factory jobs have been some of the most people have been the most eager to automate. Absolutely, and they've
And
been
so
trying to do that for a long time.
So when you look at like the Midwest or the Rust Belt, as they kind of regions, does it surprise? What's your take? Like, Yang has a theory, a hypothesis that, well, the reason Trump was elected was because a lot of people got frustrated that their futures were being automated away, and they weren't moving to Silicon Valley or the Upper East Side and becoming hedge fund managers. They were kind of stuck, and they wanted some new way, and Trump offered a different approach. Is your position like, well, no, like automation has always been happening, nothing changed in the last 10 years that was different even 30 years ago, and maybe we're reading too much into the Trump election and the Midwest issues?
I mean, it's definitely seems true that Trump was elected in part on a lot of unhappy people in more rural, more middle America, less well-educated, less rich places. That seems obvious. Yes, those people were unhappy. They're unhappy about a lot of things. There was a whole package of unhappiness. And Trump was an innovator in the sense of standing up and saying, I represent you, and doing that in a credible way. And nobody else did that. And nobody else really appreciated how much pain those people were in and how much they were pissed and wanted to do something, even stick a finger in someone's eye, which is kind of what they did with Trump. So, yes, they were in pain and they were hurting, but they don't necessarily know why they're in pain or why they're hurting. That's a much subtler thing. So politicians, while opportunistically blame it on something that people can relate to and understand, and then they'll reach for that, whatever they find most plausible. So that might be immigrants, it might be cultural elites ignoring them, it might, whatever it is, they're unhappy and they want to blame something. So I definitely notice that people reach for automation as one of the first explanations they have about changing economies. It's just makes sense to people as a kind of thing that be going on. And it takes an economist to tell you, look, there's a dozen other things that can also happen in economies in addition to automation that can affect who has what jobs, etc. And I'd say in this case, it's just not automation. That's the main thing happening there. Even though automation is a thing that you can reach for in your mind and say, yeah, I get that could be happening. And eventually, as I say, automation will be a really big thing. Eventually, it really will be a huge thing that happens. But at the moment, that's not the main thing going on. That's not why, Indiana is hurting.
And if you zoom out and you say, well, look, there could be lots of factors for people hurting. What if we just said that, look, the economy is evolving. Maybe it always has been evolving.
Yeah.
And the whether it's new or it's sort of a repeated pattern, there's going to be a class of people who used to have close to middle class or middle class jobs, and they could afford a car or two and put their kids to college, working in a factory or working in retail, or driving a truck, right? And let's just say for all kinds of reasons, those jobs may not be as available or prosperous as they once were. What I remember years ago in economics class, there was always this argument that, well, like the economy will have new needs and people will have new jobs. And the thing that I don't remember in econ class was like the individual impact and the transition. Because like I believe that my kids will be fine, or these people's kids will be fine. But if you're like 40 and you're working in a factory and then that you get replaced by a machine, it's hard, right, for you to find something new, especially if you're in an area where the whole economy was centered around like a few factories.
So absolutely, if the economy doubles every 15 years, that's only because a lot of things change every 15 years, and that changes helps some people and hurts other people. And when you look at the details, obviously, some cities will grow and some cities will decline. Some industries will grow and some industries will decline. Some professions will grow, some professions will decline. You can't change the economy radically every 15 years without a lot of reallocation and change in decisions about what's important and what's not, and what skills matter and what skills don't. So that's been a nature of the industrial economy for a century or two, that everybody has had to put up with this uncertainty and insecurity, that you're just because you got a good thing now doesn't mean it'll be a good thing in 15 years or in 30 years. That's just the nature of the economy. So the question is, what do we do about that exactly?
Mm-hmm.
Now, in one sense, we're rich, and that's what the industrial economy has been doing. So we are able to do more about it in the sense that we have more money to spend. But if what we do with our wealth to deal with the problem prevents that change in adaptation, we may well slow down the growth and prevent it, because it requires a lot of big changes in who does what, how. So that's the key risk, is how can we insure people against this risk? So we're again, the word insurance,
right?
How there's a risk, your job may be in decline, your place may be in decline, your profession may be in decline. How do you handle that risk? So social insurance would be the philosophy under which the government should handle that risk. The government should look out for who's being hurt and do something about it. And private insurance would be the scenario where you should be handling that risk yourself, being a rich person who can do things. So, either one needs to be done at some level. And so the question might be like, why have we been dealing with this risk differently lately than we were over the last century? So I'd say there's two things going on fundamentally. One is, as we get rich, we're less willing to make adaptations that are painful. For example, if you've grown up in the same town and you like it, and the factory leaves, in the past, you'd have to leave town too. Go somewhere else, pick up and make new friends, new family. It's painful, it's troublesome, but hey, that's what you had to do. Today, people aren't doing that so much. Why? Because they're kind of rich enough not to. That is, they're not rich, but they can stay where they are. They got this old house, isn't worth that much anyway. They've got friends, they got family, they got some money, and so many of them choose not to move, not to make the big painful disruptions that people used to do to go elsewhere. And another part of it is we have social insurance set up that's tied to location. So a lot of the benefits programs we have, you have them from where you are, and they don't move easily to somewhere else. Unemployment insurance, Medicare, even many other kinds of benefits, certainly family and friends, they don't move with you if you move.
Yeah.
And so that pushes people to stay, and even more people owning houses. Then they have that house that's underwater that they're really tied to, that they don't want to leave. So we've, over time, tied people more to their place through houses, through benefits programs, and in a sense, just through being rich and comfortable enough not to desperately leave. So it's, in history, when people picked up and went to another city, it was often because they was kind of hurting at home. I mean, things have gone down and things look bad at home, and that's why they left. A lot of Europeans, they came to the US, a lot of Asians came to the US, not in part because of the wonderful opportunity where they were going, but in part because it was really crappy where they were leaving.
Yeah, that's it's so true. Like as an American expat who's currently working in Europe, it's been fun to talk with some Europeans because they remind me like, hey, we didn't actually send our richest people to the colonies.
Right.
And
those who could stayed. Those who couldn't stay, who left.
Yeah. And it was a pretty long journey. So they must have really been hard off, to kind of make that trek. And I guess to your point, when you hear statistics about people are less geographically mobile in the States, I guess there's two ways to interpret that. One is, okay, well, why isn't this labor supply more dynamic? But I guess the other one is like maybe people are doing good enough that they don't feel like they have to leave, Pittsburgh.
Some blame also should go on the housing policies and land allocation properties of the big rich places where all the jobs are. San Francisco, New York, et cetera. They aren't very welcoming of these incoming people because they really make it hard to build new housing. And so housing is more expensive than it needs to be.
Yeah.
That some blame should go there too. It's less clear that that's the main thing, but.
So let's talk about one form of potential insurance. I can't not talk about universal basic income with a real living economist.
And so that's that's why I brought up the subject of the robot insurance.
Right.
So you can think of universal basic income as robot insurance. You can say, well, here's here's your universal income. It's guaranteed, and when the robots come, it's still guaranteed. So there you are. You're protected against the robots. Ta-da! Right? And that's true. But
it sounds like that's not your
It's just
view
not very
of
well
ideal.
targeted as insurance.
Right.
That is typically what you want as insurance is money in the situation that's problematic. So if you have automobile collision insurance, that's money that happens if you have an automobile collision.
Yeah.
Just handing you that amount of money every month just in case you have a collision is much less targeted toward the collision. It would be much more expensive insurance. You know, imagine how much money you would get from the insurance company every month if you had a collision every month and you had insured that. Well, that's a ridiculously large amount of money, right? It could be $5,000 or something, right? So insuring by just making sure you get the steady stream of money, no matter what, is a very expensive way to insure against particular problems.
So when you get into an automobile accident, the insurance company sends like an investigator, and they have a police report and all this kind of thing.
Yes.
If I lose my job or I get less hours, who
How do
knows
we tell?
if it's maybe it's automation.
So that's why it's so much cheaper to insure against general conditions in the whole economy rather than your particular situation. So in the literature of insurance, if we want to insure you, say, against losing your job because you were, depressed or something, how do we know if you were depressed? That's really hard to tell. If we're insuring you against losing your job because the economy hits a recession where a third of the people lose their job, well, we don't need to look at your details to hear that. If you have insurance that pays off when a third of people lose their job, we just look and see you're unemployed and a third of people are out of work. Boom, you get paid. So the robot insurance is actually pretty easy to manage in the sense that in the scenario where the robots say take half the jobs, that'll be pretty obvious.
Right.
Now, maybe when you usually lose your job early in that process, there'll be a period of time where you don't collect in the insurance yet because only 20% of people have lost their jobs to the robots, and you're one of those 20, but it hasn't reached 50% yet. But when it hits 50%, then your payments come in. So now there's a trade-off of how targeted we want the insurance to be to you in your particular circumstances, because as you say, that gets expensive. We have to now study you more carefully.
Yeah, I guess part of the challenge that, or the appeal to me of the universal basic income is the simplicity and cost of administration.
Yes, of course.
And also the incentives. Like if we said, well, you only get the insurance when you lose your job, then in a strange way, there could be some people who are like, well, I guess I don't work and I'm going to get this thing, Right.
Or
so how do you think about that?
I mean, a lot of people have been worried about universal basic income displacing other welfare programs. So as you may notice, behind the scenes, one of the big disputes is, are you going to add universal basic income on to all the other benefits? Or are you going to swap it out for the other benefits? That's, in a sense, the real big issue. If you just add it on, then, of course, all these other cases will be covered by the existing things. But then it's going to be really expensive to add it on because it's a lot of money. If you swap it out, well, now there are these people who are especially needy that you're not especially helping.
Right.
Right. So like Medicare, for example, might cover you if you have cancer and have a lot of cancer expenses. And universal basic income by itself isn't going to do much for that. It's going to just give you a basic income. So many people who are, in favor of the welfare state or the large social insurance programs we have are wary of basic income if it comes in the form of swapping out for the existing programs, because they believe that even though these existing programs are expensive to administer, that expense comes for the benefit of targeting the people who are really in trouble rather than just handing money to everybody. So I don't even know if Yang has taken a position on that swapping versus adding issue, but that is in some sense the key issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's got, maybe I would call it a bit of a hybrid approach where it does stack on top of some government programs. I would imagine a lot of the swapping might happen in terms of the growth of government programs in general, moving towards a UBI, which I think might be the most practical way to get this done, because it would be very hard to swap with the Democratic Party, and it would be very hard to stack unlimited with the Republican Party. So maybe he's trying to find that that middle ground.
Well, now the question, well, then initially it won't be a big UBI. It'll have to be a tiny UBA to start and then slowly grow. And, and then for a long time, it won't achieve these benefits you were hoping of, letting someone, survive on the UBI because it's too small initially.
Yeah, that's true. I guess I would say I'd rather have something small that can grow over time than nothing, especially if maybe it were, to your point, the amount of the UBI maybe could reflect the state of the economy and the amount of job opportunities.
So here's a key issue with respect to the robot insurance risk. When a robot economy comes and displaces most human jobs, it won't be evenly spread across the earth.
Right.
It might not have much representation in many cities and many states and nations. There might only be 3 big cities in the world where all the robots are. And those places are growing by gangbusters and everything else is not. And if your UBI is tied to a local tax base, it doesn't insure you against that problem. That's the key point. So many kinds of insurance have what's called reinsurance. If the risk is too large for your insurance company to handle, then the insurance companies insure each other through reinsurance. Right. And that can allow insurance companies to handle, say, a big hurricane happening in one place in the world or a big earthquake where the insurance companies in that area just don't have enough money to cover it, but the insurance companies across the world do. So if we cover things like robot taking jobs risk via UBI, and the UBI is based on a local tax base, it doesn't work to insure against that problem. So that's, in some sense, the biggest criticism of UBI as insuring against the robots is it doesn't have the right tax base. Now, yes, if we reinsured with other nations, if we made treaties with other nations so that our UBI would be covered by them if we didn't have enough taxes, well, then, yes, you'd be covering that. But that would be a pretty hard treaty to set up, I think.
Now, do you believe, wouldn't you agree that at least UBI at the federal level allows you a little bit of
what insures against a variation within the United States? Right. But if the United States is just not where the robots are, right? Say they're all in China or India or, Poland, wherever the robots are, it's hard to predict. If they're not where you are, then you lose. Right.
It seems, and to your point, it would be hard to negotiate a global international insurance plan. It's hard enough to get,
but insurance companies do it, in fact. So for example, if we just made a requirement that you bought this robot insurance, then the insurance companies will of course offer it, and the requirement can be, and it must be globally reinsured.
Right,
that would work.
So then, in that case, then you don't even need the governments to agree.
Well, you might need the government to just require it.
I see.
Just to say you have to get you have to get robot insurance. You can buy it from many suppliers, however you want, but you got to get the robot takes the jobs insurance, and it has to be reinsured internationally.
I just feel skeptical that we can get countries to agree on anything like they.
Well, again, we wouldn't have to get countries to agree in this case. The United States, or even just your state, could say, you must get robot takes the jobs insurance. I will even give you a voucher or something, but it will. But the requirement is it has to be from a reinsured insurance company.
Oh, it has to be from an insurance company that has reinsurance.
Exactly, to cover it.
I see.
So now it's the insurance companies that are making the deal, not the nations.
And they got to go out to the other insurance companies all over.
Right. But they're used to that. That happens all the time. I mean, it's a very standard thing. So that would work. Now you'd be covering the risk.
And then I guess the rub would be some people in the US would say, whoa, this is the land of the free. I am not going to be compelled to buy your crazy robot insurance the same way I don't want to be compelled to buy health insurance.
Of course, but you're doing the same thing if you tax them to give them a UBI. I mean,
yeah, that's true. Except at least they get something.
Yeah. Well,
versus like, well, maybe I'll need this because
that's the nature of insurance, right? So actually, there's a common problem in many developing companies called first dollar health coverage. So as you may know, health insurance, as insurance, is most valuable for the unexpected, rare, big expenses.
Right.
But in many developing countries, for political reasons, they offer what they call first dollar coverage. They'll say, here's $500 worth of medical coverage. that will cover for you. And after that, you have to pay. So it's the opposite of insurance. It's covering the small regular expenses and not the big risk. But many people like that better because, hey, they're sure to get this benefit. Just as you say, that politically, it plays better to give everybody a sure thing rather than to insure them against something they rarely experience.
Yes. Robin, we could talk about automation for a long time, but you have such an interesting background. There are other topics I want to hit with you, then we have to get to some questions from the audience. But the other topic that I was really curious about was relates to UBI, which is how Yang is proposing to fund it using a value-added tax. And I've heard a couple of views on this. One is that it's a great idea because it's harder for firms to avoid paying it, like they do avoid potentially paying or minimizing their corporate income tax. And I've heard another argument, which is, this is just a burden on the working person, and adds more complexity, and there's all this paperwork. And so I was just kind of curious, like I've got an economist on the live stream, might as well ask him about that.
So unfortunately, this is not an area I've specialized in. I don't know. Definitely I've heard that, say, in Europe, they use value-added taxes more. And, for a proportional tax, it seems to be, more behind the scenes and less open to, say, people cheating on their taxes, et cetera. It'll limit tax fraud and tax cheating because it's less money in your hands to not pay. But of course, it's more proportional. So the more you were trying to do progressive taxation, the more you have to do something other than just a value-added tax, although that's quite possible. I should say that among the stuff I've seen from Yang, the democracy dollars is the thing I would say, yeah, that's a great idea. When you're looking at people being concerned about corruption of politics, there's this very basic trade-off of some people saying we really can't let those rich people dominate politics, and other people saying free speech and, hey, your government's going to decide who's allowed to say what. That's pretty dangerous. And the democracy dollar proposal cuts through that nicely. Hand everybody $100 that they can only use to donate to political things, and that will swamp the current amounts of money coming from other sources. And that solves the problem. I like it.
It's funny you brought this up. I was actually talking about this with my wife, who is still learning. It's funny. I have this weekly video about Yang, but she doesn't watch this channel at all. But I was trying to explain her democracy dollars, and she was kind of incredulous, like saying, "Oh, but how could we afford to pay $100?" And I was like, dude, it's like $20 billion a year. That's nothing.
It's small. Absolutely.
Country.
It's definitely.
Like we spend more on, probably foreign aid to any one given like major country that is a recipient of our aid, or, various other government programs. And the impact could be tremendous because
I actually think it's not necessarily actually solving a problem, but it's setting aside the appearance of a problem. And I think that's well worth the money spent.
Oh, so go in, elaborate on that. So you don't think more?
So I actually don't think we have huge problems because rich people are spending too much on politics. I don't think that's the problem. We have a lot of problems with politics, but that's not it. But I get why people think that's a problem. I get from their point of view why they see that as a problem, and I want to reassure them. And this money is money well spent, just to reassure them that it's not a problem.
I see. So for me, the democracy dollars is not necessarily because I feel like rich people completely control the system. For me, the value of democracy dollars is that it allows more people to compete for these elected offices, and that
it depends on where the democracy dollars will be spent. So I'm actually not sure that that'll be the outcome. That is, so you're looking at democracy dollars will come from ordinary people, and it'll go to whoever they like. And so the question is, do ordinary people's preferences concentrate more or less among a small elite of politicians than the rich donors' preferences? And it's not clear to me that it is less concentrated. Ordinary people's, when they watch TV shows and movies, etc., they often herd and all go to the same one. And it's often rich people who have a diversity of tastes who support, unlikely neglected options. So it's not obvious that if we have more public base of the spending, that will spread it out over more people.
maybe this is an exception to the rule, but I would argue that Yang is a perfect example of a candidate that lots of people want or have interest in, but rich people and established sort of media do not take seriously. And had everybody had $100 to give, like, I mean, we know for a fact that Yang has already had over 200,000 donors, but they're small dollar donors. They're like $10, $15.
I mean, it's definitely true. Everybody wants to pitch how they're getting the money from small donors. That's a big selling point. People want to say, I'm getting my money from small donors, and that's a competitive thing. But again, look, I'm happy to say it sounds like a good idea. So we don't have to agree that this benefit will happen, in the sense that if it does, that's even better. But if it doesn't, that's also fine.
So just so I can understand it, is what you're arguing that, hey, if everybody had it, they may just give money to the same people that already get raising a lot of money. Or
they may give it to different people, but it doesn't that much matter.
Why doesn't that matter?
So a basic thing to understand about the world is politics just doesn't matter as much as people think, or they like to think. People get really obsessed about politics. They get really focused on it. Their blood pressure goes up, and they really care. And it just doesn't matter as much as they think. So if we look at nations around the world, even, it's like whether they're democracies or not doesn't actually matter that much. In terms of, on average, democracies grow about as fast and are about as rich and prosperous as non-democracies. Actually, the non-democracies tend to have more variance, and the democracies have more of a steady rate. Democracy versus non hardly even matters for which policies nations pick. The main policies that make a difference on are political repression. Non-democracies do more things in the range of political repression, i.e. shutting up opponents. But other than that, they do pretty much the same things.
So let me test that. Let me test that argument. I would take the position that the election of Donald Trump has actually had a major impact on America, that it's resulted in more polarization
in politics. Yes. In the world of political discussion and passionate conversation, of course, affects, because that's the whole world of politics. Yes. So here I have a slogan, which is, politics isn't about policy. That is, we talk as if politics were about policy. We talk as if we cared about the tax rate and the benefits and how we were going to manage crime, etc. But mostly politics is about the conversation. It's about talking about politics. It's about my people winning versus your people winning, and my people being celebrated and your people being dissed. And that's what most of politics is about, is who gets respect, who gets attention, whose narrative wins. And people really care about that, and they're really into it. We have a lot of studies, even in economics, about elections, and apparently donations to elections, it's really hard to find effects. It's really hard to find effects of candidates with more money winning more.
Interesting.
I don't know if you've heard about that, but
I haven't heard that one.
That's actually been a standard, result in the literature. You could argue maybe there's small effects, but they're not big. And so, and of course, the conversation just before an election doesn't really matter as much as most people think. Most elections are predicted basically how the economy is doing, how basic things are doing, and recent things people say just before the election don't actually typically matter that much for who wins. So I have a PhD in formal political theory. So I have studied this, and I know a lot of the literature, and it's not what people want to hear because they're really invested in politics.
So let me unpack.
But I'm happy to reassure them. Again, I'm happy to spend some money. So if they think they see a problem, let's cover that problem they think they see and make them reassured that things are okay.
When you say politics is not about policy, when the president appoints Supreme Court justices for life, how is that not impactful to the country?
It's not as impactful as people think. Even the Supreme Court and their decisions is based on sort of the large evolution of the legal profession and its attitudes and the entire culture. Which particular judges are on the court at which particular time, in the long run, doesn't really matter as much as the overall attitudes of society. And the Supreme Court in particular is very attentive to what society thinks and not going too far ahead or behind of what everybody else wants. They are political in that sense, and they are known to be so.
So interesting. You're such a great guest, Robin. I love this kind of fresh perspective. I do want to jump to one other topic, and then we'll take some questions from the audience.
All right.
And I can tell from the chat that the audience is kind of fired up, which is great.
I look forward.
So the first, before we get to the audience stuff. So audience, while you're we're waiting, like, go ahead, feel free to type some questions, and I'll try and get to highlight a few of them. But before we get to that, one of the things that I noticed was that you wrote a book about how humans are motivated. Their behavior is often motivated by their behavior is driven by motivations that may not be what they say they are.
Exactly.
Or, people do things for different reasons, I guess. And I was curious with that lens. Yeah, the elephant. Is it elephant in the brain? Or yes.
Elephant in the brain.
Elephant in the brain, which I think you can buy on Amazon.
Of course.
Right. I'll probably put option later. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. But I think the connection just got weak for a moment.
All right. So from your kind of unique perspective, because you're an economist, also studies how people make decisions and how people think, which I guess in today's world of economics is quite more common than maybe back in the day when I was doing Econ 101. But what's your view on 2020, this whole election? Do you feel like it's mainly a bunch of people arguing over stuff that doesn't really change that much, to your earlier point? Or what's your take when you watch what's going on in the primaries and with the president?
Well, the first reaction is to say, look, the last election was a big surprise, right? The last election contained news that a certain base that you could appeal to had been felt neglected, and somebody figured out that they were there and they were bigger than people thought, and successfully appealed to them and won. That was the big news of the last election. And the most striking fact about the current election cycle is that people are not talking much about that news. That is, you might have thought people would be all over, well, I'm going to appeal to that base now, or I'm going to try harder to get to that base because look what happened. And in some sense, many people are sort of said, well, okay, Trump won them, but Sanders almost got him. And that would be another approach to get this same sort of base. And so a lot of people said, well, okay, let's take a shot at being like Sanders. And a lot of people took that, swing to the far left as a stance they thought could be winning stance, given what happened in the last election and given what a lot of people have been saying over the last 4 years. So clearly that was initially in this election cycle, the thing a lot of people thought was plausible. Hey, Trump won, Sanders could have won, Sanders is pretty extreme, let me try to be extreme. All these people on Twitter seem to like me talking extreme, so Sanders and Warren and some other people all went toward the extreme. And what we've seen over the last month or two is that people are reining that back in, because a lot of people said, what, are you crazy? The electorate isn't that extreme. But you're going pretty extreme. And, at the moment, the winning moves seem to be a little more conservative, a little more middle of the road moderate. And that's where we are at the moment. But in some sense, it's all gambling on, well, what's the mood of all those unhappy people out there, and who will they go for? And especially since over the last 5 years worldwide, we've seen a lot of these unhappy citizen movements, a lot of riots, a lot of protests, etc., for lots of different reasons in each particular place. But there seems to be this general phenomena of a lot of unhappy people out there willing to throw out incumbents to put other people in, or willing to protest against incumbents. And that's, a lot of the uncertainty about the current election, especially since what we just saw in the United Kingdom. We say, look, some sort of a rebel just won. And the big question is, well, what kind of a rebel will appeal how in the current United States environment? And I don't know the answer to that, but that seems to be the right question. The best basic question to ask is, the last election was this big clue. Hey, a realignment, you didn't get it right. You didn't understand who wanted what very well, because look, you were surprised. And now all around the world over the last 4 years, we've seen a lot of similar sort of surprises. And so how will that translate into this election?
Yeah. So if one of the takeaways from 2016 was that there's this population of very unhappy, disgruntled people who are tired of kind of conventional leadership. And we see that trend continuing internationally. And let's say in 2020, those unhappy people are at least, let's say relatively as unhappy as they were in 16. Then nominating a conventional moderate candidate like a Biden, let's say, wouldn't that just repeat 2016? Wouldn't those same unhappy people say, well, look, you didn't listen again. You gave me Hillary with a different name. I don't want that.
So this is the basic problem with figuring out the world. When we look back, we often see these trends and they seem obvious. We say, why couldn't people figure them out at the time? And here we are at the time. This is exactly why you can't figure them out at the time. If you look at all these revolutions over the world in the last 4 or 5 years, the consistent pattern is people are unhappy and they pick something different, but it's not a consistent different thing. Mm-hmm. They're going in all different directions with what they pick.
Mm-hmm.
And so it makes it really hard to say, okay, they're in the mood for something different, but what? And from where we sit at the moment, it's pretty hard to tell which different kind of thing they'll go for. So that's a good time if you're just an oddball different thing to just throw your hat in the ring, which is kind of what Yang's done. Say, It could be my kind of different. Who knows? You don't know what kind of different it is. I could be the kind of different people want. Let's just give it a try. But you shouldn't feel very confident. I mean,
but could we at least agree that Joe Biden is not different? He's like the opposite of different.
Well, but worldwide, most places haven't picked something different, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's an increased rate of picking something different, but still the not different things win more often.
All right. Well, I want to get to some.
We don't know is my answer. I mean, which is why I tend to focus on big long-term trends, big fundamental issues. I realize it's very hard to make these short-term predictions about who's winning where, but I also think people just pay too much attention to it. I think they neglect the big basic fundamental issues, the big long-term issues. And so that's where I put my expertise.
No, I appreciate that. Anybody that talks in a time horizon of centuries or even decades is very unique in the political world.
Unfortunately.
So I'm glad you're taking the long view. And I would say this, though. I don't know. I guess if you took your framework about the need for insurance, I can't think of that many other Democratic candidates or Republican candidates that are talking about other forms of insurance to protect people against these kind of systemic changes.
You mean something other than UBI?
Yeah.
Well, yes, then that's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Like the federal jobs guarantee I've heard talked about by Sanders. I don't know about that one. I mean, as an economist, I'm guessing you're probably not a big fan of the government literally producing jobs. Or maybe, I don't know.
I would rather government took a light touch with respect to things that require a lot of judgment and detail getting it right. They aren't that reliable at getting detail right. So when there's a big general problem, if they just take a general policy, then that can be helpful. Asking the government to make specific bets is much riskier.
All right. First question we got from Mo Farrow. What role would automation have on other parts of the economy, like not just factory jobs and retail, but agriculture, food processing? I'm guessing you would argue it would.
Automation has long been having effects on the rest of the economy. It's not just in those areas, actually.
Yeah,
but it's hard and slow. So one way to think about automation that our recent analysis suggests is people have been thinking about automation as driven by the technology, i.e. when a computer gets faster or a machine gets better, then we automate. Another way to think about automation that fits with the data better is that it's a wave that spreads across a landscape. So if you think about the Old West being colonized in the US, the colonization of the West wasn't fundamentally because of changing technology. It was because you had a bunch of people in a place, and then going to the nearby place was attractive. And when you had a lot of people in the nearby place, then going to the next nearby place became attractive. And the wave moved across a landscape. And at each point, it was not in your interest to be too far ahead of the wave because you'd be all by yourself and you couldn't have much support and infrastructure. But if you get too far behind the wave, it's too late and everybody else has already done it. And similarly, we can think about automation as this wave that moves through the landscape of jobs. Jobs are connected to jobs and near jobs when they're done in the same place by the same people with the same equipment, when one sends an input into the other, et cetera. And actually, we can think of the increasing automation as that sort of a wave. Mainly a job gets automated when the jobs near it get automated, when the tasks near it get automated, because that's what makes it easy to automate. If machines are doing the things around you, then you already have them standardized. You already have the inputs thing. It's already in a mild environment. You already have metrics and measuring what the problems are. That makes it easier to automate that next task. And so if automation started in agriculture or manufacturing, then it stays near that because it's easier to automate a task that's next to other tasks that had recently been automated.
So if you are in a job and you look to your left and right and you see a lot of machines,
yes, exactly.
you may want to start thinking about getting that insurance a little like sooner, or transitioning somewhere else.
Well, now one of the most automated jobs is software. But that doesn't mean software jobs are going away.
Right.
As we automate more and more software tasks, that makes all the other software tasks that aren't automated all the more valuable.
Yeah. I remember
so actually in our data, just to be clear, when we look at jobs getting more or less automated, that does not predict losing number of workers or changes in pay. Over the last 20 years, when a job gets more automated compared to other jobs, it does not get more or less workers. It does not get higher or lower pay. So the basic fear that as jobs get more automated, they lose is just fundamentally wrong, at least looking on average.
What does the data say about the people that used to be in the jobs that were automated? Because what I've noticed, let's just say you mentioned software.
You lose, of course.
Yeah.
if you get displaced from what you were good at and something another person does it or another machine does it, you lose locally as a result. On average, you lose.
Yeah. As an example, I have worked in software since the let's say late 1990s. We used to have a lot of testers, people that would just test the software to make sure it works. And now a lot of that
much more automated.
Is much more automated. And unfortunately, some of those testers were able to become regular software engineers.
Right.
Many of them just didn't have the right skills.
Exactly.
And
they lose.
They are they don't work in those companies anymore. So, but I agree with you. The number of engineers has not gone down. It's just that those roles have kind of changed, and and actually the roles that are still around are paying way more than the testers would. But it's still like that's a hard consolation to the guy that
of course
gets let go.
But as we said, that's been going on for a century or two.
Yeah.
And in the past, people had to adjust, and that was part of the price of living in a rich, vibrant, dynamic society. Is you had to change.
Yeah, maybe part of the challenge is people's willingness to undergo those disruptions is less. Like
I think that's right. So I think that's kind of the paradox of getting rich.
Yeah.
We've gotten rich by the disruption and changes we've allowed and embraced. And when we are rich, we're less willing to endure such things.
Yeah.
We figure, why should I have to do that?
Yeah, because if your parents or grandparents, landed on Ellis Island and they had nothing, and then your job gets changed, you have to move to another city. Like, it doesn't feel that like big of a deal. But if you're multiple generations living a good life, and then your job goes away, the idea that, wait a minute, I have to now move to another town and learn a brand new skill and start from the bottom. That seems crazy now.
Especially if maybe you're 50 years old and you figure, well, I'll just retire early, and I have my house. I'll live on a limited budget. My wife will still work, and people make all these compromises where they live poor, but they don't have to disrupt their network.
Yeah. All right. So Ethan asks, if it's not automation, what is his diagnosis? He just said lots of factors. What does that mean? What are the factors that are leading to people's struggles if it's not just automation?
So clearly there's a change happening in that there's a set of interrelated jobs in the bigger cities, and the advantage of being in the bigger cities has definitely gone up. So the advantages of small rural areas has gone down relative to the advantage of some big city clumps. That's been a clear thing. And we've switched which kinds of jobs we're, pay more for, et cetera. So In big cities, the jobs people do are more interconnected. They're more tied to each other. And that's, in fact, one of the simplest things that explains what happens in cities. The jobs that happen in cities are exactly the jobs that have to be done in coordination with lots of other jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you have a firm, initially, when you're a young new firm, you have to do it near a big city because you're changing a lot and you need a lot of resources. But as you get to be a mature firm with a mature product, a mature set of customers, then you tend to drift out of the city where rents are cheaper and employees are cheaper. And then you do more predictable, reliable things in, suburban or rural distribution centers and factories, et cetera, because you don't have to be tied in and coordinate so much with all those other city things. And so cities have just become more valuable in the sense that more tasks need to be coordinated with a lot of other tasks. And of course, the rural kind of tasks are, in fact, the kind of tasks that are easier to automate because they need to coordinate with your other tasks. But automation isn't the main thing. It's
right.
All these other things going on. And of course, there's aging of the population, and that people are, moving far later in their lives and less willing to move. They're more tied to their neighbors. We have more regulations and zoning and things that make it harder to push people into owning houses, then make it harder to leave, make it harder to move near these big cities and take a cheap rent.
So you've brought up the rise or maybe the concentration of jobs and opportunities around these cities more than the rural areas. Do you see that trend? Has that been going on for a long time and it's steady? Is it accelerating? I mean, if you fast forward, are all the jobs going to be in San Fran and New York?
Over 2 centuries, it's gone back and forth several times. So that means I can't be that confident about the next 100 years. I could say, if it's happened over the last 20, it'll probably continue over the next 10 or 20. That was as far as I'd go. So for most of these things, you want to know how long has a trend been going on before you think about how far you want to project it into the future. The longer and more consistent a trend is, the more you want to project it. So for example, some of the most consistent trends over time are organizations are getting larger. So people like to talk about startups and small, nimble, new firms, and that's sexy and stuff. But the actual trend is consistently larger firms, larger, more bureaucratic firms, more layers of management, more rules. That's a consistent long-term trend. So I'm going to predict that forward. I'm going to say, the economy is going to continue to have larger, more complicated organizations that manage things.
The thing about the cities argument that, companies often like to be in cities because they'll have access to a diverse supply of valuable labor or skills or experiences, and maybe they have to work with other suppliers or clustered around the same area. Makes a lot of sense to me. If I'm one of the 300 million Americans who may not live next to these big cities, I'm kind of screwed.
Well, you can move. That's kind of the point we were talking about. You're not.
And then pay like $1,000 a square foot in Burlingame.
So that's the question, right? If you're more valuable, you'll have more income to spend on rent, but the rent is even higher, in part because of the zoning and other land use restrictions we placed. So an interesting parallels between cities and firms. So cities and firms are our main units of organization in the modern world. They're the main things that are different about our world than the world 1,000 years ago. Cities are much larger, firms are much larger. They both have the same importance, a bunch of coordinated activity that needs to be done, with close interaction. And they've both been increasing in size and importance over the long term. People emotionally have very different reactions and attitudes toward firms and cities, but at some level, they are similarly important units. And just like people are working in larger firms today, they are working in larger cities today. And that's part of progress, is to get people to move that way. A lot of people would prefer to work for a small firm, but you know what? Big firms are consistently pay more. They are more innovative. They have more education. They give more benefits. Even though people give a lot of shit and say bad things about big firms, they are actually quite consistently beneficial to their customers and their employees compared to small ones. And people don't like to admit that. They're more willing to be fans of big cities. So some people love New York and they'll just go away. And then you think, yeah, but at least you kind of understand their emotional reaction because you think it's okay to fall in love with the city. You don't think it's okay to fall in love with the firm.
Right.
But
now with the cities, don't you feel like at some point and maybe your argument that it oscillates every century or two applies here, because what I've noticed when I visit large cities is they physically seem to be struggling with just handling the growth. Like if you try and commute
Sure.
in the Bay Area,
But that's a sign
you
of
know,
winning. I mean, those are the problems you get when you're winning.
yeah.
The rural areas are not struggling with all their people because they're losing.
So do you think then naturally companies will start moving out of these big cities because the labor may not be willing to live in that quality of life reaches a point where they're like, hey, I don't want to pay these crazy amounts for real estate and sit in traffic for 2 hours a day.
But changed real estate policies would allow a lot more.
Yeah, you've alluded to that. So say a little bit more about that.
We're not near the limits of that, really. So you might think we just can't have more people near these big cities, but that's just not true. If you've been near San Francisco in the Bay Area, you can see, like, compared to Manhattan or something, it's very low level, right? It's not dense and high. It's flat. And it's just the rules that are making it hard to build that stuff more densely. But it could be a lot more denser. And, in most cities like Houston or Cleveland or et cetera, there's some dense center part, but there's lots of land nearby that could be denser if it was allowed to and people wanted to be there.
Right. So you're saying this is for the real estate issues in the Bay Area are kind of a self-inflicted malady. All right. Let me go to this next question. Do you think that income affects happiness and mental health, but also has diminishing returns at some point?
Well, the best data we have says that the relationship between happiness and income is diminishing returns right from the start. It's roughly logarithmic, but that means it never stops. So when you double income, then you have a certain improvement in happiness, similar to other doublings. And so going from, $1,000 a year to $2,000 is about the same as going from $10,000 to $20,000 is about the same as going from $100,000 to $200,000. So that's diminishing returns, quite literally, but it also means there is no apparent upper limit. You just slows down in the way you might actually expect. Now, there's different kinds of happiness. Importantly, there's meaning, which is more about your global evaluation. And then there's the momentary, how do you feel at the moment? And that's more called happiness or satisfaction. And they have different relationships to things. But a fascinating data set from England suggests that, in fact, happiness or satisfaction is linear in rank. That means if we rank everybody by their income and make a list of them and count what number you are down from the top, that's your rank. And that you mainly care about your rank. You care about being higher than other people and lower than other people. And this data is really precisely estimating this linear and rank thing across a very wide range. And so unfortunately, this suggests that it's really hard to do anything about the overall happiness, because you can't change the distribution of rank fundamentally. The distribution of rank is whatever it is. There's one guy at the top and one guy at the bottom and one guy halfway in between, and that just can't move. So you can change who's more happy than others by moving some people up or down, but you can't actually change the overall distribution of happiness if happiness is just linear in rank.
Is that arguing that if I'm number 7 and the number 6 guy above me makes twice as much money, I'll be just as happy as if the number 6 guy above me makes 100 times more than me?
Yes, that's what it's suggesting. So it's suggesting that if we spread out the income range, that our intuitions adjust for that.
Right.
We're really asking, well, how many people are above me and how many people are above them? And the income number is just a proxy to help us tell that.
Okay, so if I were to take this to an extreme, if everybody made almost the same amount of money, but just off by a couple pennies,
right,
people would still be just as pissed because they're not number one.
If they could know it, if they could know that number.
So interesting. Well, Robin, we're about out of time. We're a little over time, but
this has been a lot of fun, and I'm happy we wandered across the space of topics we did.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been very thought-provoking, and I'm sure as I think more about this conversation, it'll cause me to kind of ask other questions and do some more research.
Well, I'd be happy to talk again sometime if you're ever in the mood.
Yeah, well, for people who are equally intrigued, how best should they keep up to date with what you're working on or your research or what you're thinking about?
My website is hanson.gmu.edu, and on Twitter, I'm at Robin Hanson. I have a blog called Overcoming Bias. I'm fortunate enough that if you Google my name, I'm the guy who comes up at the top. So it's easy to find out about me. At
Robin Hanson on Twitter. Is that right?
That's right.
All right, I've got it even scrolling for you, Robin. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
And I do wish Yang well. He's definitely one of the more interesting candidates. He's certainly nerdy, and I like that. And so I just emotionally connect with him more by seeing the nerdy guy there on the stage.
Yeah, I think he probably refers to looking at data more than most candidates.
Yeah, no, he seems to be aware of a lot of intelligent things, and he's not afraid to mention them, whereas other people really dumb things down. So I respect that. Yeah, well, it's a move forward, and maybe we don't agree on everything, but we probably can agree that you should try and make decisions based on data and logic and what the evidence shows us, and that you probably won't. always the optimist, Robin. Well, thank you very much. Have a great New Year and happy holidays. And to everybody out there, goodbye, nerds. Goodbye, nerds.